manufactured products declining is continuing.
The growth rate in the current year will be higher than last.
We must be able to take tougher steps and get the better of the runaway inflation that we are noticing in this country.
Weak industrial output, declining savings and investment rate, volatile stock market, sliding rupee, a rising current account deficit drawing foreign inflows, and now inflation inching up once again. Alarm bells ringing for the Indian economy. Hello and welcome to We Mean Business. I'm Shweta Rajpal-Kohli. Today we ask, are India's fundamentals getting weak? And is the India growth story still intact? Let me introduce our guests on the show today. We've got a president of CII, Adi Godrej is also the chairman of the Godrej Group, joining us from Mumbai. Dr. Ila Patnaik, professor at NIPFP, joining us from Delhi. And also Sonal Verma, India economist of Namira, joins us from Mumbai. A.V. Rajwade of Forex and Treasury Risk Management Consultant joins us from Mumbai. And P.K. Chaudhary, VC and Group CEO of ICRA, joins us from Kolkata. Many thanks for joining us on the show. But first, let's take a look at some of the big questions we're trying to address on We Mean Business today. Are India's fundamentals getting weak? What's a bigger worry for the economy, growth or inflation? Will the rupee continue its slide? Is India scaring away foreign investors? Is the perception much worse than reality? Has India Inc. lost faith in the growth story? Is it the worst phase that we are seeing since 1991? Before we move on, let's take a look at some of those key macroeconomic indicators. Inflation, for instance, the data that was released today that has come as a big shocker at 7.23% for the month of April, much worse than expected. We also got a bit of a shock on Friday with the industrial output data coming at minus 3.5%, again much worse than expected. An all-time closing low for the rupee. The rupee, remember, is down 10% in the last 3 months. Stocks have been very volatile, down 13% in the last 1 year. We already know that Standard & Poor's has cut India's outlook to negative, and also today Moody's downgrading 3 private banks. So are India's fundamentals really getting weak? Let me go straight across to Mr. Adi Godrej to make sense of what's really happening. Mr. Godrej, if we look at some of those indicators, clearly a big cause of worry. Yet policymaker after policymaker keeps telling us time and again when we question them about the direction of the Indian economy that India's fundamentals are very strong. How would you react to that?
Well, clearly the fundamentals are weakening. Clearly growth has slowed down. The IIP numbers were very poor. Of course, I think the IIP index needs to be looked at closely because the numbers seem to vary a lot from month to month. Earlier also they had reported incorrect numbers, so I'm not so sure whether it is a very reliable index. Inflation is a little higher than was expected. I think it was expected to be around 6.5, 6.7%. It's turned out to be 7.2 or 7.3. I don't think that's a very important factor. What really needs to be done is both government policy and RBI policy should be growth oriented. If we don't revive growth, other things will be difficult to control. So in my view, growth should be the important objective. Interest rates need to be reduced, CRR needs to be reduced, and the rupee needs to be defended. A weak rupee is causing very poor perception about the Indian economy. Even in terms of inflation, a weak rupee is inflationary. So I feel the foreign exchange reserves should be used to defend the rupee. Even earlier, when the rupee had gone down to 52.50, 53, the RBI intervened and the rupee firmed up to around 48.50, 49. So I think the rupee needs to be defended, and we should have a clear growth-oriented policy, and government and RBI should cooperate in this.
Are the government and RBI cooperating or not? That will be another area of discussion on the show today. But let me take forward some of those very, very critical points that Mr. Godrej has raised. Growth-oriented policy is what is needed. Interest rates need to be cut down. The rupee should be defended further. Let me actually go to Ela and on some of these points. Ela, it's very well for the industry to say that the policy needs to be growth-oriented, that interest rates need to come down further. But can we ignore the inflation data that has come out today? Hasn't the task of policymakers got even tougher? What's really a bigger worry, inflation or growth?
See, we always pose it as a trade-off, but what really happens and has happened in most economies, and we've seen it happen in India also, is that when inflation is high and there's a lot of volatility of inflation, business plans don't get made. So what you've seen in the last 2-3 years is that investment growth has come down, investment growth has declined, and investment growth has not declined merely because nominal interest rates are high, but investment growth has declined because there has been a lot of uncertainty. You don't know whether you're planning for higher raw material prices or lower raw material prices. You don't know whether your sale price is higher or lower, or what the level of inflation is going to be, and it upsets all business plans. So industry always asks for lower interest rates. After all, it's a cost of production, and industry is not even expected to ask for higher interest rates. They never do. So the point is really that it's not as if we will achieve higher growth by cutting interest rates and that will be enough. That will not be enough, and it would not have been enough even if we had put it in place for a couple of years. Now you think about inflation, it's been higher than 5 or 6%, especially consumer price inflation, since 2006. And whatever little information we have on inflationary expectations, we've got into a wage price spiral. It's not easy to get inflation down at this time, and it's also not going to be easy to get growth up. I think another point on which I do want to contradict Mr. Godrej is that the rupee should be defended using reserves, and that will solve the problem. The rupee cannot be defended using reserves. You've had higher inflation, which really means that you've had a real appreciation of the exchange rate over the last few years. If your inflation is higher and the rupee does not depreciate, then what do you end up with? You end up with exports that are less competitive and import competing goods again being less competitive. So you tend to import more, you end up with a higher current account deficit. And today our current account deficit is 4.3% of GDP. The fiscal deficit has gone up, the household savings rate has declined, and you can't really fight this big fundamental problem merely by intervening in the exchange rate.
All right, let me again take forward some of those points raised by Ela and go across to Sonal of Nomura. Sonal, when we talk about India's fundamentals, it's obviously a number of macroeconomic indicators that we're talking about. Savings and investment rate, as Ela was pointing out, was something that was always India's big positive. We always used to say that we have very good numbers when it comes to those savings and investment rates, but that's clearly been another big cause of worry, the way we are seeing that decline steadily. Also, how serious is the situation really right now?
Well, if one compares India to what it was 10 years ago, we are still well off. If you compare India's growth to other emerging market countries, we are still okay. But the point is we are moving in the wrong direction. Savings and investment rates are still, at slightly above 30% of GDP, but they have been declining over the last 4 years. Our growth in the coming years is going to be determined by how much we invest today, and we are not investing anything, or at least not enough, that is required on infrastructure, on corporate capex. Because of high inflation, consumers are actually putting their money in gold, so financial savings actually going down, money is getting blocked into gold imports, physical savings, and that is basically getting reflected in a higher current account deficit. So I think the economy is moving in the wrong direction, and if this is not stopped right now, the risk is that the potential growth that we are right now saying is around 7.5% or 7% is not going to stay here. Potential is not a static concept. If you do not invest today, then there is a risk that India's potential growth can actually come down below 7%. So we need to reverse this trajectory now.
And is enough being done to reverse the trajectory? Let me also take forward the discussion on the rupee and whether or not it should be defended. Very strong views there coming from Mr. Godrej, saying that yes, the central bank needs to step in. ELA clearly disagreeing on that front, saying that no, that should not be done. Mr. Rajvare, your views on whether we need more central bank intervention to arrest the slide of the rupee? We've seen the rupee at an all-time closing low today.
Well, I think as of now, there are no easy answers to the question which you have posed, because the last 3 or 4 years of rupee appreciation, both in nominal and real terms, I mean nominal terms, leave aside the last 1 year, but earlier 3 years, I think taken all that into account, I think there is no surprise that the current account deficit has widened, that the general economic environment is not conducive to investment. In fact, major Indian houses are today probably investing outside India much more than they are investing in India. And I think that itself tells us as to how the investor is looking at the totality of the scenario. Now, coming to the specific issue of intervention, I think the problem doesn't end merely with intervention. I think two issues come up here to my mind. One is that the quantity of reserves looks adequate. It's almost $300 billion still. But the quality of our reserves is extremely poor. The reserves have been built up through somebody else's money. The money has not been earned by the Indian economy. So I think that's one sort of constraint in terms of using reserve. We have a huge net negative investment position globally. The second constraint that is particularly as of now is that the more the RBI intervenes, the more it sucks in rupees from the local market. Now then the question becomes that does it have the capacity to sterilize that intervention? Well, in the last 3 years, I was myself amazed to see when I looked up those numbers, the RBI credit to government has gone up from 50,000 crores to 500,000 crores. That's a 10 times jump in a matter of 3 years. Now, how much, so intervention and sterilization, I think would in the normal course have been probably the right remedy, but given the quality of reserves and given the liquidity impact. As for interest rates, well, the nominal interest rates have dropped, but I think in the last 3 or 4 months, the real interest rate has actually gone up because inflation has fallen more than the nominal interest rate. So I think that's a separate issue, but the RBI credit to government already. So there are limitations to open market operations. There are therefore limitations to intervention in the market.
Right, we've seen clear limitations there. That's right, very important factors raised by you there today. And even though we've seen the central bank intervening, it's had a limited impact, and at least the impact that we've seen as far as the rupee today is concerned. Let me take across one of the points raised by you to Mr. Adi Godrej, and it's something that you yourself said, Mr. Godrej, when you took over charge as the CII president. The whole perception issue, the whole sentiment issue, which is perhaps a bigger factor today, driving those fundamentals in India more than any of these specific macroeconomic indicators that we're talking about. How bad is the perception of the Indian economy? You have said earlier the perception is worse than reality. There are many others who believe that the reality may actually be worse than the perception.
No, I think the perception is quite bad, and we are adding to the negative perception. I think some of the retrospective legislations have created negative perceptions globally. I think generally the perception has been negatively affected by the IIP numbers, by the rupee depreciation. So generally the perception has been quite negative during the last 2 or 3 weeks. Now, the opportunity for India to revive growth is strong. For example, if we were to pass the GST at an early date, if political consensus is arrived at, if the opposition cooperates with the government and the GST is passed at an early date, it will add 1.5 to 2 percentage points to GDP growth. It will change the entire picture in India. And if other reforms like FDI in certain sectors, getting the direct tax code passed, and some of the other reforms that are pending are added to the GST reform, I think India's economy will revive quite strongly. GDP growth will revive. Sentiment will revive. I think the rupee can appreciate. If you look at January, when FII investment came into India, some FDI investment came into India, the rupee appreciated quite considerably after having fallen for a while. So it is very important that policy is coordinated at all levels. And we must be clear, I think unless we single-mindedly go for growth, I think it will be very difficult to come out of this situation easily.
Mr. Godrej, it's important that you raise the issue of those retrospective amendments, because you raised it also when you took over as the CII president and met the Prime Minister of the country. Interestingly, on this very show on We Mean Business, we had the Finance Secretary of the country, Mr. R.S. Godrej. I posed that question to him about how all these retrospective tax amendments are having a negative impact on the overall business environment and sentiment. He actually surprisingly said, why should the CII president care about what happens to Vodafone? Why should Indian industry be cheerleading for Vodafone? Your reaction to that?
I'm not commenting on Vodafone particularly. I am saying the sentiment created, which affects markets. And sentiments affect markets, and look at FII investments. They've begun to come down quite considerably. The stock market has taken a beating. The rupee has taken a beating. This is partly caused by the negative sentiment that retrospective amendments have caused. And it's very important that we ensure that sentiments about India are not negative.
Okay, Mr. Godrej, also we've got Mr. Rajwari raising an important point about how Indian business houses are not investing in India anymore and looking at other markets. Is that a correct assessment? Do you think India Inc. has lost faith in the India growth story?
Well, I think investment outside the country is taking place in addition to investment in India. I think it is not instead of investment in India. Indian companies have become quite sizable, competitive, and as a result they are finding it successful to compete outside India, and investment is taking place outside India, and it's certainly not instead of in India. The problem of investment in India is borrowing in India is very costly. International investments are being made at borrowing at 2% and 3%, whereas in Indian investment borrowing rates are too high. And as one of your speakers did mention, the real interest rate is going up because inflation has come down. Inflationary expectations are quite low. Crude oil is coming down. Many other commodities are coming down. It's time to act to see that our policies are growth-oriented. Unfortunately, we've been wavering a lot in terms of implementing growth-oriented policies.
In fact, before I go to Mr. Chaudhary, let me actually point out to some of those negative voices, big voices there talking about India. A lot of criticism coming in, no dearth of criticism with regard to India in the last 3 months. Before we take forward some of those points raised by Mr. Godrej as well. You've got Mark Mobius, Executive Chairman of Templeton Group, saying India is faltering as an investment destination. You've got Sunil Bharti Mittal, Chairman of Bharti Airtel, saying it's a lot tougher to do business in India today. Ellen Mittal, CEO of ArcelorMittal, Indian projects for ArcelorMittal may not see the light for the next 5 to 10 years. Deepak Parekh, Chairman of HDFC, saying policy paralysis can drag GDP growth below 7%. Yashwant Sinha, former finance minister, saying the government is on a ventilator. Rajiv Malik, senior economist of CLSA, saying it is possible that we are perhaps paying for our bad karma by suffering the inactions of a government that is deaf, toothless and spineless. Also, the Honeywell International Chairman David Coates saying foreign companies are starting to become scared here, that is in India. Mr. Chaudhary, these are clearly negative voices coming in with regard to India. Can we take this criticism lightly?
My reaction would be, first of all, you must appreciate that good times does not last forever. There are changes, there are cyclical fluctuations also. Secondly, the last few years, the good side of the story, when India was a destination for almost all global major advanced economies of the world, from that things have shifted considerably. For many reasons, there are very complex reasons. From all fronts, we are facing multiple challenges. But despite that, I have a feeling that if adequate and appropriate steps are taken, even at this stage, we need not be so disappointed. What happens is the business confidence, both at domestic front and globally, has come down very sharply. But this has external reasons and domestic reasons. Now, so far as domestic reasons are concerned, many of them can be controlled by the government policies. Even inflation rate, I mean, there is an argument that because of high inflation, we have to have policies which is against growth, but not necessarily.
Right.
Even growth can ultimately end up in increasing supply of goods and services. Now, if there is adequate supply of goods and services, the inflation may be contained through that route. So, there can be a balancing act between growth and inflation, need not necessarily contradict each other. Secondly, even inflation at present rate is not abnormally high. If you look at average inflation of India over last few years, 10 years, 12 years, as compared to that, relatively we are not in that sort of adverse situation. Now, if
actually, Mr. Chaudhary, if you could hold those two thoughts, let me take those two thoughts to my panel there. One, of course, the fact that you need a balancing act between growth and inflation, and policy needn't be anti-growth. The second point raised by Mr. Chaudhary there, that inflation is not as bad as we are making it out to be. Ela, if I could get your reaction to that. Last year, we averaged at about 9.5% for inflation. We're already seeing the April number at 7.5% or so. Should we be really worried about that inflation number? Are we reading too much into it?
No, I think we should be worried about inflation. We've had inflation which has been higher than the 4 to 5% level that is the RBI target. But Shweta, actually I think at the moment, the thing to worry about is the risk of a balance of payment crisis. I think that's something that you haven't talked about as clearly, and that's really what is worrying me most in today's situation. You have a 4.3% current account deficit. India's strategy has been, we don't want to go to the IMF for funding. We want private capital flows. Now, you can have private capital flows of two kinds. You can either have debt flows or you can have equity flows. Your equity flows depend on your policy environment. Your equity flows depend on confidence. And, you know, we've had this feeling that, oh, India's story is great because compared to other countries or because of our fundamental long-term greatness, we are going to be fine. Many a country has slipped and fallen, and if we get a very strong decline in equity flows, then what are we left with? We are left with having to turn to either private debt flows, or at the end, if they lose confidence in India and we lose those coming in, then we end up in going for official debt flows, which is something India really doesn't want to do. I mean, don't forget that you have a 4.3% current account deficit. This is the highest since we've had the reform. So this is what's my biggest worry, and this entire attitude that, okay, we can cut interest rates at this time because we need growth may be quite risky, because if you start cutting interest rates at this time, you push even those debt flows that are coming today. 23% of your flows are debt flows. Even those you push away. Those are the private debt flows. Can you actually afford to start cutting interest rates if you think of what it will do to foreign capital flows? Because you are at a very, very tight balancing act where you are financing a very large 4.3% current account deficit, and it's very dangerous for emerging economies to have such large current account deficits. I think the magic bullet now, if there is any, not that it might be a perfect magic bullet, but if there is any, is to cut down the fiscal deficit by by changing your oil price policy. That might be one way which can really reduce the risk of a balance of payment crisis. But yeah, that is the big thing to worry about at the moment, and at least in the next quarter or two, I think the government really needs to stop giving these wrong signals to private equity flows, you know, about taxes, about undoing the Mauritius Treaty. I mean, maybe the government believes it needs to be done, but it shouldn't be done at a time when you have a 4.3% current account deficit. So that's my biggest worry at the moment.
Right, Ela, that's very well put, because the balance of payment shock, also Sonal, Morgan Stanley once again warning that India is headed for a balance of payments shock. Ela there also saying that the current account deficit is her biggest worry. Would you second that view?
Yes, absolutely. We need to understand the underlying cause of a very high current account deficit. Most countries have seen exports slowing down. So in a lot of emerging market economies, the current account balances have shrunk. But what has happened in India is that the entire import bill has become completely inelastic. Despite a slow growth, despite rupee depreciating, the import bill actually remains very high. And I think what Ila mentioned in terms of cutting down the subsidies by hiking fuel prices, for instance, which would make oil demand much more elastic, is the right way to go about it. Second, why do we have, why are we still importing so much to instead of producing domestically? You take the case of power equipments, you take the case of electronic goods. We've seen imports actually picking up, whereas domestic production is suffering. So clearly this is reflecting the supply constraints that the economy is facing. So those constraints need to be taken care of. Capital flows slowing down. How will capital flows pick up if the investment climate is not right? So that needs to be corrected. So these are the issues. I think the solutions that we are seeing right now in terms of opening up the debt capital inflow channel is a stopgap solution. Ultimately the fundamentals have to be fixed. Otherwise, if there is a continuation of this confidence crisis, then debt capital inflows actually will be the first one to get out of the country. So this can be a very risky strategy in the medium term without addressing the fundamental issues of why we have such a high GDP deficit.
All right, such a high balance of payments deficit, but is there a magic bullet, as Ila was talking about, to address some of these issues? That's coming up after a quick break.
Manufactured products declining is continuing.
The growth rate in the current year will be higher than last year.
We must be able to take tougher steps and get the better of the runaway inflation that we are noticing in this country.
Welcome back. You're with We Mean Business, and we're discussing some of those alarm bells that are ringing with regard to the Indian economy. Panelists here talking about a balance of payments shock, even as the industry is saying it's time to cut rates further. Let me go across to Mr. Adi Godrej and take forward one of the points raised by panelists. Mr. Godrej, it's very well for economists to sit here and say, this is what you need to do. Cut your subsidies on fuel. You yourself mentioned a few of those issues with regard to reforms, FDI and multi-brand retail or aviation, or some of the other factors that you mentioned that will help bring India back on the growth trajectory and at least improve the overall sentiment. But Mr. Godrej, we're always reminded of the coalition dharma. This government has had enough instances of how it suffered very badly, trying to push forward some of those reforms, improve sentiment, and yet it has not happened. Where is the optimism that it's going to happen over the next couple of months?
No, I think, Shweta, it's very important that economics becomes important and politics is put on the back burner for a while. I think it's very important. CII, for example, is working with the opposition parties to push the GST reform, which, as I mentioned, is the single most important reform. The other reforms can also be pushed. I think the government needs to work closely with the opposition to try and get some of these reforms going. There are some reforms that the government can do on their own. They don't need parliamentary approval. And as I mentioned, I personally feel that if the Reserve Bank policies for a few months are oriented towards growth, I think we'll see a different picture. Inflationary expectations are definitely coming down. Crude oil prices are coming down. Many other commodity prices are coming down. With the global slowdown, the Chinese slowdown, demand for commodities will go down. The Iranian issue is being debated. There's a conference in Baghdad very soon. So hopefully that will have a positive effect and crude oil prices will come down. And I agree that we need to raise our petroleum product prices, because that itself will create some sort of rationing in petrol consumption, and that will help the situation too. We need to take steps on many different fronts to ensure that growth is restored. To my mind, if we don't concentrate on growth for the next 3 to 6 months, then many other problems will be difficult to tackle. Growth will be able to tackle a lot of the problems, and then we can then address ourselves to some of the other problems after that, after restoring growth.
Mr. Rajwade, a very, very clear recipe coming out from Mr. Godrej, from CII perhaps, as he's representing the CII view. Focus on growth, growth, growth. Let the central bank also focus on growth. Ensure that you're cutting rates, you're keeping the growth momentum growing. Now, if we were to assume that Mr. Godrej's recipe will work, given that RBI spent all of last year actually trying to tackle runaway inflation, which had limited or no impact, perhaps his suggestion may be the right one for the central bank right now.
Well, I would make 2 points. Number one is that, yes, I would sort of at 6, 7, 8, even 9% inflation rate, I would give greater emphasis to growth, greater priority to growth rather than inflation. Also, we often forget that at least a part of that inflation is very good from a socio-economic perspective. You know, the rural incomes, about 33% of the population is dependent on agriculture. Agriculture adds 17% to GDP. In other words, the agricultural dependent per capita incomes are less than half those of the rest of the economy. Now, clearly, purchasing power does need to be transferred from the other sectors to the agricultural sector. And to my mind, at least, the agricultural or the food prices inflation is not such a bad thing. The second point where I am sort of disagreement with Mr. Godrej, that industry very often considers high interest rates as an impediment to growth. On the other hand, a high real exchange rate is considered a positive feature. Now, as a student of economics, whether it's high real interest rates or high real exchange rates, both are deflationary factors for the macroeconomy. So I think probably and I completely agree with the earlier commentator, that it is not just oil and gold, it is very much the manufacturing sector, the tradable sector of the economy, which has been made uncompetitive by the last 3 or 4 years of exchange rate policy. They are just not able to compete with imports. And I think that is what is also equally showing up in terms of the deficit on current account. And I agree that there is a possibility, there is a risk of a balance of payments major crisis in the current fiscal year, and I don't see any short-term solutions to that.
Right, Sonal, a major worry with regard to a balance of payment crisis. You've yourself talked about it. There are no easy answers out there. Let's start getting closer to more workable solutions that the government and the Reserve Bank have at this point in time.
Well, I think there's no doubt that we need to revive growth, but we need to ask ourselves, how will that growth come in? Let's assume that the Reserve Bank does announce a 100 basis point cut in rates. Will that really lead to an investment surge, given the bottlenecks that industry is still facing in, acquiring land, whether it's environmental clearances? To my mind, all it will lead to is a pickup in consumption demand, and that consumption demand will lead to a pickup in growth, but it's going to turn out to be a short-term cyclical upswing. If we need growth to be sustained, we need investments to come in, and investments will not come in just because of lower interest rates. You need the investment climate to be right. You need the government to reduce its fiscal deficit so that the cost of borrowing for the private sector comes down. So I think, I'm in total agreement that we need growth back, but I think RBI really cannot do much without the government reducing its fiscal deficit. And I think that should be the number one thing to do in order to get the macro fundamentals back on track, because rising fiscal deficit is the root cause of all problems. whether it is, high inflation, which is because of fiscal policies, or it is lower savings rate, which is because of government's high fiscal deficit, or lower investments, which is getting crowded out because of the government's high fiscal deficit. So if we need an answer to the current issues that India is facing, we need to tackle the fiscal deficit first.
Mr. Chaudhary, so now they're saying that the answer lies to things moving in Delhi, not in Mumbai. The ball is in the government's court, not the RBI's court. Would you agree?
Absolutely. She has just hit the head of the nail. What happens is, always when you talk about growth, we always talk about interest rate, and interest rate is taken as a constraint of growth. But there are other factors. Fiscal deficit, balance of payment, all these problems are there. Even certain policy decisions, regulatory clarity, that whether somebody, for land acquisition, there has to be some clear policies. For environmental issues, there has to be interministerial or interdepartmental consensus. There has to be state and center dialogue on certain issues. So there are a lot of policy measures which can ultimately lead to growth despite the fluctuations in interest rate up and down. In any case, if you look at central bank policies, monetary easing has started. So that part is being taken care of and also will be taken care of. Now, this perception that inflation ultimately would be contained by moving the interest rate upwards, that itself possibly is not the right concept. Possibly, the supply of goods and services in the economy is a very important factor, and growth will bring that supply of goods and services. So even inflation can be taken care of if we take growth-oriented policies.
All right, Mr. Godrej, your response to what some of the panelists here are saying, interest rates is not something that's going to help revive sentiment, even though you believe that the Reserve Bank needs to have a more growth-oriented policy. How would you respond to some of those comments that have come in after you said that perhaps RBI's strategy should be totally pro-growth and not keeping an eye on inflation? Of course, keeping an eye on inflation, but not the way we'd seen RBI react all of last year.
I mentioned that not just interest rates, but CRR should also be reduced. Look at the demand situation. Anything that has to be financed, residential housing, autos, growth is slow. Financing costs are very high. Mortgage rates are high. If you bring interest rates down, that will create a demand in some of these sectors. And as I said, inflation the reason inflation has gone a little higher than expected earlier is because the rupee has depreciated. If you stop the rupee from depreciating so much so quickly, I think the inflation rate would also come down. We must remember that we were able to get the rupee stronger in January and February. Again, it has depreciated a lot. I think if you look at the balance of payments, which many people refer to, the balance of trade, which people refer to, one of the things which has caused a rather negative balance of trade during the last financial year has been increased gold imports. Gold prices have risen, gold import quantities have risen. I am not an expert on gold, but something needs to be done to see that gold imports are kept under control.
All right, let me start taking actually a poll here with all our panelists in terms of certain issues. We're often very critical of government policy, of RBI's policy. Let's try and identify with our panelists one big mistake that the government or the RBI has made in the last couple of months, and the one thing that it needs to do almost immediately to correct the course. Mr. Godrej, to you first.
Well, I think if you go back to the January-February period, things looked good. FII inflows had increased very considerably. FDI during the January-March quarter was very strong. The rupee had appreciated. The stock markets were up. Sentiment was good. After that, we've taken some steps which have acted negatively on the sentiment. And we've had lack of steps in terms of reform, which have also acted negatively on the sentiment. So I think the reform process should be taken forward. Some of the things the RBI did very well during the January-February period should be taken forward. I think the 50 basis point cut in rate done recently was good. Some more cut in the rates and some more cut in the CRR would add a lot of confidence to my mind. That confidence itself would get things going. And I think the government should work very strongly with the opposition to try and get some of the very important legislation through. Just the GST, to my mind, will make a huge difference in our GDP growth and sentiment.
All right, Mr. Godrej, we've got the solutions there. From your point of view, GST is going to be that big trigger. You're saying 1 to 1.5% is what it's going to add to growth. You're asking the central bank to cut CRR and interest rates further. We've got that. But a very important point that you made out there, the sentiment in January, February was much better. What has happened over the next couple of months is obviously some steps that the government has taken which have been described as retrograde. The budget clearly being that big dampener. Would you agree?
Yes, in a way. I think the budget had many good points, and there are some very good points in the budget on many industries. However, the sentiment became so negative on the retrospective amendments that all the good points were forgotten, both in India and internationally.
And really a missed opportunity in that sense, given the situation where we were in. The government probably got its priorities wrong.
Yes, I think the going in for the retrospective amendment from a sentiment point of view was very negative. It was done at a wrong time, and to my mind, some of the provisions of the retrospective amendments, GAR, etc., were coming in the direct tax code in any case. That would have been well debated in Parliament and then brought in, instead of being brought in through the budget. And I think that was a tactical and strategic mistake.
Okay, very strong words there from you, Mr. Adi Godrej. Let me go to Mr. Rajvare and try and get his sense of some of the negatives, of the mistakes that have been committed by the government or the central bank, and what needs to be done to correct it.
Well, to my mind, I mean, what we have seen in the last couple of months is, as Mr. Godrej emphasized, the changes in tax rates, etc., etc. But I think the problem goes much deeper. One is the possibility of a balance of payments crisis, which we have talked about. I am not sort of very confident that we will continue to have social stability as well. I think the sort of sudden closure of mines, the sudden closure of mines, not only iron ore, but coal and so on and so forth, the cancellation of telecom licenses. I think what we are doing is hurting a huge number of innocent stakeholders in those businesses for perhaps the sins of a few of those promoters. And I think that is also a major social time bomb probably which could explode. We have infrastructure deficit. Railways are in ICU, as the railways minister himself acknowledged. Power situation is getting more and more critical. There is no coal for the new power plants. So I think the totality, and I don't think it's a matter of the last 2 months alone. I think the last 3 years we have been drifting.
Okay, so it's really something that has been building up for several years now. It's not just the last couple of months. Sonal, your view?
Yes, I think, instead of highlighting the mistakes, let's look forward in terms of what can be set right. Sentiment within India, foreign investors' sentiment on India continues to be very weak. So we need to get the investment sentiment right. And I think what the government can do there is, send the right signal on the reform process by hiking fuel prices, increasing FDI limits in certain sectors, fast-tracking decision-making on land environmental clearances. This doesn't need any political support. These are executive decisions. This can be clearly fast-tracked. I think if we just start off with these decisions, that'll be a big positive from the government side, and which will also open up some more space for the Reserve Bank of India to cut rates. And clearly what the Reserve Bank needs to do is be more proactive on liquidity. What has happened is, because of the very tight banking system liquidity, RBI's rate cuts are not getting transmitted to consumers and corporates. So RBI definitely has to be much more proactive on tackling liquidity going forward.
Mr. Chaudhary, a quick word from you before we can actually try and get also a poll on the forecast for inflation and growth this year. Mr. Chaudhary, what according to you have been some of the grave mistakes and what needs to be done to do a bit of damage control?
First of all, I must say that maybe because of the complex situation, challenging situation, domestic and international, government has slowed down the pace of progress and implementation of large infrastructure projects. like the dedicated freight corridor and other power projects, energy projects, all those projects have been delayed. So maybe the implementation of those projects should be put on first track. That's the first thing. Second, I think a lot of reform policies, when this was being discussed, maybe there are not enough of consultative process so that there could be a consensus between federal and state governments, there could be consensus interministerial, so all those and different political parties. So I think that was not there or not adequately addressed. Because of that, certain policy decisions in terms of reforms could not be implemented in a timely manner. Third, agricultural sector, which basically supply of goods, the agricultural commodities, is an important element of the consumer price. Now this agricultural sector, enough attention was not given to that. Like at one stage we talked a lot about agricultural improvement, reforms. We even talked about the cold chain, serving the wastage of food crops. We talked about even food processing industry, but not much has been done in that front. So importance and acceleration of agricultural reforms and agricultural process, that is very critical. These three things have to be given enough importance, and right infrastructure has to be created as fast as possible.
Mr. Rajvade, a quick word from you also on where the rupee is headed. Are we going to see the rupee continuing to slide? What's your outlook there?
Well, in my view, the downward pressure on the rupee is likely to continue for the foreseeable future. We have a $60 billion plus deficit on the current account, and I don't see that coming down in fiscal 12-13. And capital flows in terms of both FDI and FII are unlikely to come on the needed scale. And we need to add to the gap on current account the maturing debt obligations. Short-term debt of something like $80 billion is maturing in the next 8 or 10 months. So I think, as somebody else commented earlier, the foreign lender is the first to sort of get out when things look bad. So I think over-dependence on external capital flows is a major issue, and given that the scale of the dependence on those capital flows has gone to a level where I think the downward pressure on the rupee is likely to persist.
And you don't believe that the RBI should intervene further? That's what you had said earlier. There should be no further intervention.
Well, for two reasons, as I said. One is that this will suck in further rupee liquidity, which we can't afford at this point of time. The second is that that increases the probability or the possibility of a default, because our external debt is already more than the reserves. So I think we should not look at merely the quantity of the reserves, but equally the quality, and I think that is what creates problems in terms of intervention on the required scale.
So now you actually had put out a report very recently talking about make or break time for India, saying that it is really the right time for the government to go ahead and take some of those tough decisions. We've talked about some of those tough decisions at length here on the show. But if you could give us a sense of what, according to you, could be the worst case or the best case scenario for the Indian economy in this fiscal.
I think, where India grows and at what rate India grows is really a function of how much we invest. When we were growing at 8.5–9%, we were investing an average of 15 to 20% per annum. In the last 4 years, our real investment rate has been around 6% per annum. And the risk is that if we continue with this dismal investment rates, potential growth is going to be below 7%. So even to stay status quo at 7–7.5% potential growth, we need to accelerate our investment, and to get back to about 8% kind of a sustainable growth level, we need a massive push on investments, and all of this at a time where the global environment is not conducive. Most of the global consumers and governments are deleveraging, so the global environment is not going to be supportive, and we really need to get our own house in order to ensure that the investment rate does not collapse further, and to ensure that growth does not fall below 7%, because for a low per capita income economy like India, that is clearly not a good solution.
There are clearly no easy answers to the current crisis that the Indian economy finds itself in. Sonal, before we wrap up, many right now saying that this is worse than 1991. Would you agree?
I think we are a lot better than in 1991. Sure, the external sector looks very close to the precarious situation of 1991, but we do have to remember that we have FX reserves which we did not have then. The growth numbers have come down, but it is much lower than what we used to be, of 8.5% to 9%, but it's definitely better than 1991. And the investment and saving ratio is above 30%, which was not the case then. So I do not think that we are, getting to a situation as bad as in 1991. We are far better than that. But I think that's not the question. We've seen the 2003 to 2008 period of high growth, low inflation, rising investment rates. What we want to ensure is that that was not a one-off in our history books, and that we can continue that. And in order to continue that, we need to get our house in order, which means getting the root causes of the deteriorating fundamentals right. And the root cause is the government's rising fiscal deficit and the governance deficit. So if we need to get back to the 03-07 period kind of high growth, low inflation, we need to set these two things in order.
All right, will we be able to do that or not remains the big question here on. The government, remember, has a very, very limited window of opportunity there to press the accelerator and ensure that it moves forward on some of those very, very critical indicators that are required to ensure that India can move forward on that growth trajectory. Thank you all for joining us and sharing your views on this very special show today. Remember, you, the viewer, can also send us your feedback on our show. You can SMS us at 56388 WMB space and your feedback at 56388. You can send us an email at wmb@ndtv.com. You can also write to me directly on my Twitter handle at ShwetaRKNDTV. And with that, it's a wrap here on We Mean Business today. We'll be back with another issue tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.